Hi. I'm talking about a way that people communicate today. I haven't seen it described before, and that's why I'm making this video. So, it's a type of communication that has three parties. It has the speaker, or the writer, the forum audience, and the actual audience. And what makes this form of communication unique is that it appears to be addressed to the forum audience. That's why it's called the forum audience. But the communicated message and more than the communicated message to the forum audience, the fact that the speaker is communicating to the forum audience is part of the message to the actual audience, right? So it's not just that the speaker is talking to two different groups at the same time, but the fact that the one group is being addressed is part of the message that's given to the second group. Okay. And it looks kind of like this. So this is meant to show that the speaker is communicating to the forum audience, addressing the forum audience directly, but that message is also carried to the actual audience. And the fact that the speaker is communicating with the forum audience is part of the message to the actual audience. Okay. And I'll have some examples of this later so you can sort of understand more clearly what I'm talking about. So it's different from some other types of communication that I've seen described, like a dog whistle. A dog whistle is communication where the speaker is talking to the forum audience and also another audience at the same time, but the communication to the actual audience is encoded and takes some explanation or some, uh, membership in a subculture to understand it frequently. And not always even separate audiences. Oftentimes, the forum audience and the actual audience will be the same, and they'll just be receiving one. I guess you could call it the literal message and then the coded message at the same time, right? And that's not what I'm talking about here, although that's interesting in its own right. It's different also from a fake conversation. Well, I'll have an example of this later on where you'll see that there are times where a speaker is addressing two different audiences at the same time, but the fact that the speaker is addressing the forum audience is not part of the message to the actual audience. Okay, so this is what I was just talking about. So there's a movie called In the Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood back from the 90s, I think. He was old, but not as old as he is now. Yes, in the past he was younger. I don't know if people know that about him, but he used to be younger than he is now. He is his character is I think a Secret Service agent, and he's in an elevator with an assassin who has whose plot has been foiled by Clint Eastwood's character, played by John Malkovich, by the way. Um, and let's see, so he's got a gun to Clint Eastwood's character's head, and he's threatening him, and Clint Eastwood appears to be talking to him, but he's also actually talking into his radio at the same time and sending coded messages to the other Secret Service or FBI agents who are listening on the other end. And then the last message he sends is aim high, and that's when John Malkovich realizes, oh, he's actually been talking into his radio this whole time. This is not what I'm talking about here, because the fact that he's talking to John Malkovich is not part of the message that he has for his colleagues on the other end of the radio. It's more like a dog whistle, because until he says aim high, all the messages that he sends could be construed literally and contextually appropriately by John Malkovich's character, but interpreted differently by his actual audience, which is his colleagues listening in. And they do eventually shoot out the windows, and I think John Malkovich dies. I mean, his character dies. John Malkovich didn't die. Not yet. So that was what I'm not talking about. Now, onto what I am talking about. So, again, in the type of communication that this presentation is about, you've got the two audiences. There's a scene in a show that just came out on Netflix this year called Giri Haji, where characters are talking to each other in their first language, and there's a character who doesn't speak their language who thinks they're having one type of interaction when they're actually not. They're actually having a different kind of interaction. So the scene that I'm thinking of, a father and a daughter are in a policeman's office, and the policeman asks them a question, and he thinks that they're talking in Japanese about the question that he asked, but they're actually talking about a completely different question and sort of using the time afforded by the question to just have a completely different conversation. Um, and the message that the policeman receives is they are so when the father and the daughter speak, they're sending a message to the policeman that they're communicating with each other, right? And the message that they're sending to each other is different from the message that they're sending to the policeman in that conversation. Now, this is an unusual example because the policeman doesn't understand literally what they're saying either, but there are some other examples of this, the type of communication I'm talking about here, where the appearance of sending a specific message to the forum audience is part of the message to the actual audience as well. In this case, it's not, but it maintains the basic components of what I'm talking about as a what did I call this at the beginning? A display communication. Um, the example that I always think of first, actually, is when George W. Bush, in the run up to the Iraq War, was telling Saddam Hussein to disarm, but he was telling him on uh, American television. Actually, I think it was a press conference, so anyone who had cameras there could have seen. But you would think that a president would have a different way of telling another president to disarm if he wanted to communicate that message directly. The fact that he was communicating this simultaneously to a viewing audience across the world, but especially among uh, his constituency in the United States, says to me he was trying to tell his audience in the United States that he was communicating with Saddam Hussein and telling him to disarm. And this had the effect of legitimizing his later invasion of Iraq by satisfying the American audience that he had tried every other option. So the fact that he was communicating to Saddam Hussein and telling him to disarm was part of the message to the American audience, who, in my uh, formulation here, is the actual audience of his communication, right? It's questionable whether or not Saddam Hussein was intended to receive the message at all in this case. As I said before, I think presidents have other ways of communicating with one another when they really want to communicate a message. So to me, the communication with Saddam Hussein was basically for display in this case. I mean, completely unnecessary, right? Except as a way of convincing Americans that he had communicated with Saddam Hussein. Okay. So this might be the kind of communication that's going to become more prevalent, sort of like writing became more prevalent after technology made it possible. Um, the internet midwives, is that an unnecessarily loaded term? Facilitates a lot of this type of communication by, especially on Twitter, making communication with the other side visible to all of one side as well, because all Twitter communication besides private messages is always public. Um, so you get a lot of these memes on Twitter, sometimes on Facebook too, but um, on Twitter especially, where one side is appearing to try to communicate with the other side, but is really communicating to their own side that they tried to communicate with the other side, that they tried to be reasonable, right? And this, I think, to me, has the effect of rendering the other side appearing even more um, mindless, even more cult like, even more unquestioning, because you have good people on your side trying to communicate with them, but they still won't listen to reason, right? But again, if you look at it through the lens that I'm proposing here today, it's not really an attempt at communication with the other side. It's an attempt at communication with your own side that has the form of appearing to communicate with the other side. This is a letter to the editor from a reader of a particular newspaper. Um, and this one actually, to me, was a bit of an ambiguous case because this speaker really could have been trying to communicate with the other side and just happened to choose a public forum as the place where he did it. But it's hard to judge his intentions. But it could also be described with the terms that I introduced earlier. Um, if he's in a position to benefit somehow from impressing people who see that he wrote a letter in a newspaper, appearing to try to reason with the other side, and that therefore increases his own legitimacy to his own side. I don't know if that was his intention, but it's a bit of an ambiguous case for that reason. He could have been trying to communicate with his own side indirectly by appearing to communicate with Republicans, or he really could have been trying to communicate with the Republicans, and then the observers from his own side are an accidental side effect. So another example of this type of communication, and here I'm wading a little bit into waters that are waters. How do I conclude this metaphor? Unfamiliar waters for me. This isn't really unfamiliar because I did study criminology as an undergrad, but some people will disagree and probably probably think that I'm trivializing this issue, but I'm really not. The definition that we learned in criminology of terrorism is some kind of violence, usually violence, some kind of interaction with an audience. And interaction sounds like I'm reducing violence to something more benign, but some kind of interaction, including violence, with victims in order to affect a political audience. And that's why things like the Boston bombing are terrorism, and the killing of George Floyd doesn't fit this definition, at least by the intentions of the officer who killed George Floyd, because he, as far as we know, he wasn't trying to influence an audience, although it did, of course, have an effect on a larger political audience. So what separated terrorism from simple violence in the courses where I learned about terrorism was the existence of this other audience, which makes it very similar to the kind of communication that I'm talking about in this presentation. So, without an actual audience, it's just violence, right? It's not terrorism. Terrorism requires some kind of political motive, and there's a reason that terrorists don't kill their victims in secret, right? And then, I don't know, this is sort of a holdover from my time in Japan. I often thought that children's English classes also had this shape. So when I say children's English classes, I mean private companies having children, minor students, whose classes are paid for by their parents. And the reason this has the shape of indirect communication is because the children are not in a position to pay, only the parents are. So the teacher, not really the teacher, but the system, at least the school, cares a lot more about the parents than it does about the children. If they didn't have any children and the parents just kept paying them anyway, I'm sure they would be happy with that. So the interactions between the teacher and the children are a form of indirect communication, where the fact that the teacher is interacting with children is an act of communication with their parents. And that's important because the parents have to be satisfied that they're getting their money's worth, and the parents are the ones paying for the lessons. And in this case, at some schools, and I hope my school wasn't one of these, but at some schools, you'll see that the types of interactions that teachers have with children are designed to be explicable to parents whose English levels are often quite basic. So teachers will not delve too much into like pragmatics in English. I don't mean teaching meta language or pragmatics, but the kinds of conversations that are very natural and easy in English and can be taught to children pretty easily, but parents don't understand because they've never learned that kind of thing, at least parents in Japan. And at the big schools, the schools whose curriculums are set, somewhere in Tokyo and then distributed all across Japan, the classes don't usually include that type of lesson because parents wouldn't understand it, parents wouldn't know that the children are getting anything, and therefore parents wouldn't pay the schools for those kinds of classes. Okay, so those are some examples of what I was talking about when I say display communication. Let me go back to the first slide so you can see that again. I'm not an expert in communication. I guess I kind of am. I'm an ESL teacher, but I'm not a communications professor or anything like that. So if someone has already named this, I defer to them. But if not, I think this is interesting and becoming more and more common nowadays thanks to Twitter. Okay, thanks for listening.